The train let out a long, final sigh of steam, a weary sound that seemed to settle in the very marrow of the mountains. For Clara May Thompson, it was the sound of the world leaving her behind. She stepped down from the carriage onto the hard-packed dirt of the platform, and her bare foot met the frozen ground with a sharp, biting shock. The cold shot up her leg, a cruel welcome to the town of Cutter's Pass. She flinched, her weight shifting to the other foot, the one still clad in a scuffed, worn-out lady's shoe with a broken lace, the hem of her dress. A thin calico garment the color of dishwater was frayed and stained with the grime of a 3-day journey. It wasn't fit for a Wyoming autumn, let alone the early snow that dusted the high peaks overlooking the town. In her hand, she clutched the handle of a torn carpet bag, its contents meager and pathetic, a spare shift, a tin of lye soap, a cracked daguerreotype of a mother she barely remembered, and a letter. The letter was from Mr. Silas Croft, a man she had never met, a rancher who had paid her passage from Missouri with the promise of marriage. His words had been plain but decent, speaking of a good spread, a sturdy house, and the need for a wife to make it a home. For a woman with nothing, it had sounded like a kingdom. Now, standing on the platform with the wind whipping strands of her pale hair across her face, she understood it had only been a fool's dream. The train, her last link to any other life, pulled away with a mournful groan of steel on steel, its whistle a fading cry in the vast, indifferent wilderness. She was alone. The townspeople of Cutter's Pass, what few there were, stopped to look. Their stares were not curious, but sharp and pointed, like shards of ice. A woman herding 2 small children pulled them closer, her lips thin with disapproval. 2 prospectors leaning against the general store's porch rail stopped their whittling to gawk, their grins missing teeth. Whispers followed, catching on the wind like burrs. "That's her, the mail-order bride for Silas Croft. Don't look like much, does she? Heard she ain't got but 1 shoe. Runaway, I'd wager, or worse. Got that look about her. Troublemaker." The words seemed to hang in the air, a visible brand. Clara's cheeks burned with a shame so hot it felt like a fever. She scanned the small crowd, searching for a face that might belong to Silas Croft, a man of 40 years. The letter had said, with a strong build and a fair hand. There was no one. The station master, a balding man with a sour expression, came out of his office and tacked a notice to the board. He glanced at her, then quickly looked away, as if her poverty were a contagious disease. She knew then he was not coming. The knowledge settled not with a crash, but with a slow, sinking dread that hollowed her out from the inside. She had been left on the platform like unwanted baggage, a parcel with no recipient. Humiliation was a physical thing, a heavy cloak that settled over her, colder than the wind. She wanted to scream, to weep, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The Rocky Mountains loomed on all sides, a fortress of stone and pine that trapped her in this place of judgment. So she did the only thing she could. She walked, limping, to a wooden bench at the far end of the platform, and sat down. She drew her bare, freezing foot up under the thin fabric of her skirt and wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the broken pieces of her dignity together. She would wait. Perhaps there had been a mistake, a delay, a lost message. Hope was a stubborn, foolish thing, and it flickered weakly in her chest. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The cold deepened, seeping into her bones. The townsfolk went about their business, their occasional glances a constant, stinging reminder of her predicament. The whispers had died down, replaced by a more damning silence. She was an object of pity and scorn, a spectacle to be observed and then forgotten. Shivers racked her body. Small, violent tremors she could not control. Her teeth chattered, a frantic rhythm against the growing stillness of twilight. The hope that had flickered just an hour before was now all but extinguished, leaving behind a cold, gray ash of despair. She was going to freeze to death on this bench, she thought, and no one would even remember her name. From the shadows of the livery stable across the dusty street, a man watched. He had been there for some time, leaning against a support beam, motionless as the mountains behind him. He was a large man, built of the same rugged material as the land itself. A heavy coat made from the pelt of a gray wolf was slung over his broad shoulders, its fur coarse and wild. His face was framed by a dark, untrimmed beard, and his eyes, when they caught the last of the dying light, were quiet and deep-set, the color of a winter sky just before a storm. He did not stare with the same crude curiosity as the others. He watched with a solemn stillness, his gaze missing nothing, the shivers that shook her frame, the way she tucked her bare foot out of sight, the utter desolation in her posture. His name was Elias Boone, and he was a man who knew the look of a creature cornered by the wilderness. As the last sliver of sun vanished behind the jagged peaks, plunging the pass into a sudden, sharp cold, he pushed himself off the post. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He crossed the street, his heavy boots making no sound in the thick dust. The few people still lingering turned to watch him, their expressions shifting from disdain for the woman to a wary respect for the man. Elias Boone was not one of them. He was a man of the high ridges, a trapper and a hunter who came down from his mountain only when necessity demanded it. He lived by his own laws, and the town gave him a wide berth. Clara did not hear him approach until his shadow fell over her. She looked up, startled, her heart leaping into her throat. He was immense, a towering figure against the twilight. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. She tensed, ready to bolt, though she knew there was nowhere to run. But he did not speak. His quiet eyes held hers for a long moment, and in them she saw not judgment, not pity, but something else, a deep, settled sorrow, a recognition, without a word. He shrugged the heavy wolfskin coat from his shoulders. The air around him seemed to drop another 10 degrees without its protection. He leaned forward and gently, carefully, draped the coat over her shaking shoulders. The weight of it was immediate, a solid, grounding presence. And then the warmth began to seep in, a slow, spreading miracle. It smelled of pine smoke, of cold air, of leather and man. It was the first true warmth she had felt in days, and it was so overwhelming that tears pricked the corners of her eyes. She clutched the rough fur, her knuckles white, and stared up at him, speechless. "Boone!" A gruff voice cut through the stillness. Sheriff Brody emerged from his office, his hand resting on the Colt at his hip. He was a thick, barrel-chested man whose authority was as much a part of his uniform as his tin star. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze moving from Elias to the woman huddled in his coat. "What do you think you're doing?" the sheriff asked, his tone laced with warning. Elias did not turn to face him fully. "Keeping a woman from freezing," the sheriff grunted, his eyes narrowing on Clara. "That's Silas Croft's intended, or she was. He rode out this morning. Said he got a letter from her people back in Missouri. Seems she ain't exactly the respectable widow she claimed to be. Seems she's trouble." He looked back at Elias. "You take her in. You're taking on her trouble. Folks in this town won't look kindly on it. You'd best mind your name if you get tangled up with the likes of her." Elias finally turned his head, his quiet eyes meeting the sheriff's. His voice, when he spoke, was low and even, a rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "Then they'll talk." The simple finality of the words hung in the air, a clear and unshakable dismissal of the sheriff, the town, and all its judgments. Sheriff Brody held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a short, frustrated shake of his head and turned away. "Don't say I didn't warn you," he muttered, before disappearing back into his office. Silence descended again, thicker this time. Clara looked from the sheriff's closed door back to the formidable man standing before her. The warmth of his coat was a comfort, But his presence was unsettling. She did not know what he wanted. Men always wanted something. I have nowhere to go, she whispered, the admission a painful, ragged thing torn from her throat. Elias nodded slowly, as if he had already known. I have a cabin, up in the mountains. He paused, his gaze fixed on some distant point over her head. It's warm. There's food. You can stay the winter. Nothing more. The offer was a lifeline, but her pride, raw and wounded, flared. She had come here to be a wife, not a charity case for some wild mountain man. Who was he to think he could simply claim her? She pushed herself to her feet, the heavy coat threatening to slide from her narrow shoulders. Thank you for your kindness, sir, she said, her voice stiff. But I cannot. She tried to shrug the coat off, to hand it back to him, to reclaim that last tattered shred of her independence. But as she moved, a gust of wind tore down from the pass, a physical blow of razor-sharp air. It cut through her thin dress, and the cold she had been holding at bay crashed over her in a violent, unstoppable wave. A shiver so profound shook her that her knees buckled. The coat was the only thing holding her up. The fight went out of her, extinguished by the brutal, undeniable truth of her situation. She could be proud, or she could be alive. She could not be both. She sagged against the bench, pulling the coat tighter around her. Her agreement was not spoken, but he saw it in the slump of her shoulders, in the way her gaze fell to the dusty platform. We leave at dawn, was all he said. And then he turned and walked away, his form swallowed by the encroaching darkness, leaving her alone with the scent of pine smoke and the astonishing weight of his kindness. The journey began in the gray, pre-dawn light, a world of shadows and silence. Elias had appeared at the platform as the first hint of sun touched the highest peaks, leading a sturdy pack mule. He carried a rifle in the crook of his arm and a sack of supplies on his back. He had simply nodded at her, and she had followed. The wolfskin coat her only shield against the biting air. They left the sleeping town behind, heading north, straight towards the wall of mountains. The trail was little more than a deer track, winding upwards through hills dotted with sagebrush and skeletal aspens. The ground was hard and uneven, and every step was a fresh agony for Clara's bare foot. Small, sharp stones bruised the tender sole. The frozen earth scraped it raw. She tried not to limp, to match his long, steady stride, but the pain was a constant, searing pulse. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, determined not to show weakness, not to be a burden. By mid-morning, they had entered the dense timberline. The world became a hushed cathedral of ancient pines, their boughs heavy with a dusting of snow. The air grew thinner, colder. The trail became steeper, slick with patches of black ice hidden beneath the fallen needles. Her good shoe offered little purchase, and her bare foot was now numb, a dead weight she had to drag with every step. She did not realize it was bleeding until she saw a small, crimson smear on a patch of snow she had just crossed. She quickly scuffed it over with her shoe, her heart pounding. Elias walked ahead, never looking back, but she knew he was aware of her. He moved through the wilderness with a quiet, practiced ease, a part of the landscape itself. He seemed to know every rock, every tree, every shift in the wind. She was an intruder here, clumsy and fragile. The sun was high in the sky when it happened. They were crossing a narrow ledge of shale, a steep drop to their left. Clara placed her good foot carefully, but when she brought the other forward, the numb sole slid on a patch of unseen ice. Her ankle twisted violently. A sharp cry of pain escaped her lips before she could stifle it. She stumbled, her arms flailing for balance, the carpet bag flying from her grasp. She was going to fall. But before she could hit the ground, a strong arm wrapped around her waist, catching her and pulling her back from the edge. Elias had moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size. He steadied her, his grip firm and unyielding. "I'm all right," she gasped, her voice trembling. her face flushed with shame. She tried to pull away, to stand on her own, but when she put weight on her foot, a bolt of white-hot agony shot up her leg. She cried out again, her body sagging against his. Elias looked down, his gaze finally falling to her feet. He saw the torn, bloody sole of her bare foot, the unnatural angle of her swollen ankle. His expression did not change, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. She tried to hide the injury, pulling her foot back, but it was too late. He had seen the truth she had tried so hard to conceal. For a long moment, he was silent. She expected a rebuke, an impatient sigh, the frustrated anger of a man delayed. It was what she had always known, but he did none of those things. He simply bent down and, with one smooth, powerful motion, lifted her into his arms. She was so light, she felt like a child. The shock of it stole her breath. One of his arms was securely under her knees, the other wrapped firmly around her back, holding her against the solid wall of his chest. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart. "I can walk," she protested weakly, her hands coming to rest on his shoulders. He ignored her, adjusting his grip to hold her more securely. He looked down at her, his quiet, stormy eyes meeting hers. His voice was a low murmur, barely louder than the whisper of the wind through the pines. "I'll carry you the rest of the way." He turned and continued up the trail, as if she weighed nothing at all, his stride as steady and sure as it had been before. Clara lay in his arms, her head resting against the rough wool of his shirt, and watched the snow-laden branches pass overhead. He had not said it with pity, or with charity, or with any expectation of gratitude. He had said it like a simple statement of fact, as elemental and undeniable as the mountains around them. For the second time in less than a day, this silent, formidable stranger had offered her a kindness so profound it left her utterly undone. The cabin, when they finally reached it late in the afternoon, was nestled in a small, sheltered clearing, backed against a sheer cliff of granite. It was small and rustic, built of thick, hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. A plume of thin smoke rose from a stone chimney, a welcome sign against the darkening sky. Elias carried her across the threshold and into the single, dim room. He set her down gently on a simple cot covered with a thick bearskin. The room was sparse but clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire crackling within it, casting a warm, flickering glow over everything. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a set of shelves holding a few tins and sacks, and not much else. It was a place of solitude, a fortress built against the world. Clara felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made her dizzy. She was safe. She was out of the cold. But as Elias moved about the small space, stoking the fire, unpacking the supplies, his large frame filling the room, a new feeling crept in, a quiet, unnerving fear. She was here, in this remote place, completely at his mercy. He had been kind, yes, but he was still a stranger. She knew nothing of him, of the life he lived here, of the ghosts that surely haunted such a lonely place. She had bought her safety, but she did not yet know the cost. Later that night, after a silent meal of dried jerky and hardtack, Elias laid a fresh poultice of herbs on her throbbing ankle. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his large hands careful and sure. When he was done, he banked the fire for the night and retreated to a pallet of furs on the other side of the hearth. Clara lay on the cot, wrapped in the bearskin, listening to the sound of the wind howling outside and the soft crackle of the embers. Sleep would not come. Through the cabin's single, small window, she could see the stars, cold and brilliant in the black sky. She turned her head and saw that Elias was not on his pallet. He was standing by the window, looking out. After a moment, he pulled on his boots, took his rifle, and slipped out the door, closing it silently behind him. Curiosity, stronger than her fear, pulled her up. Wincing, she hobbled to the window and peered out. The moonlight silvered the snow-covered clearing. She saw Elias walking towards the back of the cabin, towards a small thicket of pines at the base of the cliff. He stopped before a small mound of earth, marked with a simple, weathered wooden cross. He knelt down in the snow, resting the rifle beside him. He bowed his head, a dark, solitary figure in the vast, moonlit silence. Clara could not see his face, but she could feel the weight of his grief, a palpable thing that reached her even through the thick glass. A name had been carved into the cross. She could not read it from this distance, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it was a woman's name. She backed away from the window and retreated to the cot, pulling the furs up to her chin. This man, this silent savior, was as broken as she was. He was tethered to a ghost, chained to a memory, and she, who had just escaped a cage of her own, knew that she could not afford to be tangled in his sorrow. Kindness was a trap. Hope was a lie. Love was a fool's errand that ended in ruin. She closed her eyes. The image of him kneeling in the snow burned into her mind. "I won't fall in love," she whispered into the darkness of the cabin, her voice a fragile, desperate vow. "I won't be that foolish again." Clara woke to a sound that was not the wind. It was a sharp, rhythmic crack that split the frozen silence of the morning, a sound of deliberate, human force. For a moment, disoriented in the pre-dawn gloom, she thought it was the snap of a branch under a heavy load of snow, but it came again, a clean, percussive thwack, followed by the splintering groan of wood. Pushing herself up on one elbow, she felt the familiar throb in her ankle, now a dull ache rather than a sharp pain. The fire in the hearth had been banked to glowing embers, offering just enough light to see the empty pallet of furs across the room. Drawn by the sound, she swung her legs off the cot and hobbled to the cabin's single window. She rubbed a clear circle in the thick frost that coated the pane and peered out. The sight that met her eyes made the breath catch in her throat. In the clearing, surrounded by a fresh blanket of snow that seemed to glow in the nascent light, stood Elias Boone. He was stripped to the waist, his back to the cabin. The morning air was so cold it was a visible vapor, yet he seemed oblivious to it. With each powerful swing of his axe, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunched and coiled like thick ropes. The firelight from the window danced over his skin, illuminating a landscape of old wounds. A long, puckered scar ran diagonally from his left shoulder blade down towards his ribs. The pale, dead skin a stark contrast to the living flesh. Smaller, fainter lines crisscrossed his back, a silent testament to a life of violence she could not begin to imagine. His body was not merely strong, it was hardened, tempered by solitude and hardship into something as unyielding as the granite cliffs that loomed over the cabin. He was a part of this place, wild and scarred and utterly self-contained. He finished splitting a log, set the pieces aside, and drove the axe into the chopping block with a final, definitive thud. Only then did he seem to notice the cold, rubbing his arms before gathering a load of wood and heading back toward the cabin. Clara scrambled back to her cot, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pulled the bearskin up to her chin, feigning sleep, feeling like a spy who had witnessed something private and elemental. When he entered, bringing a blast of frigid air with him, she kept her eyes closed, listening to the soft clatter of him stacking the wood and coaxing the embers back to a proper flame. Later that morning, driven by a desperate need to be useful, to pay for her keep in some small way, Clara offered to cook. Elias had a small sack of dried beans, and she remembered her mother soaking them overnight before boiling them for hours. It was a simple task, one she felt she could not possibly fail. Elias simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and handed her the pot before heading out to check his trap lines. She failed, distracted by her own swirling thoughts and the unfamiliarity of cooking over an open fire. She let the water boil away. The smell of scorching beans filled the small cabin with an acrid smoke. By the time she pulled the heavy iron pot from the flames, the bottom layer was a black, carbonized mass, and the rest were a mushy, smoky ruin. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes. It was one more thing she could not do right, one more piece of evidence of her own uselessness. When Elias returned, his face ruddy from the cold, he did not say a word about the smoke or the smell. He looked at the pot, then at her tear-streaked face. He took a tin plate, scraped a portion of the less burnt beans onto it, and sat at the table. He ate them slowly, methodically, without a single word of complaint or criticism. The silence was more devastating than any scolding. She could not eat. She sat across from him, her hands clenched in her lap, feeling the full, crushing weight of her inadequacy. His quiet acceptance was a kindness she felt she did not deserve, and it shamed her more deeply than any anger could have. The day settled into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Elias would leave at dawn and return at dusk, sometimes with a rabbit or a grouse to show for his efforts. Clara, confined to the cabin by her still-healing ankle, took it upon herself to create order in the small space. The cabin was a man's dwelling, neglected and purely functional. She began by sweeping the packed earth floor, her broom a bundle of twigs Elias had fashioned for her. She scrubbed the rough-hewn table with lye soap and melted snow until the wood grain showed through the years of grime. She found his small stash of clothes, 2 flannel shirts and a pair of canvas trousers, and saw that they were riddled with small holes and split seams. With a needle and thread from her own meager bag, she began to mend. As she worked, she watched him. She learned the landscape of his silence. He was not a man of many words, but his quiet was not empty. It was filled with a pain he held so close it had become a part of him. Sometimes, when he sat by the fire oiling his rifle, his hands would still and his gaze would drift into the flames, his eyes seeing something far beyond the small cabin. In those moments, she could feel the presence of his ghosts, the weight of the memories that kept him walled off, even from himself. He seemed a man who had intentionally hollowed himself out, leaving only what was necessary for survival. She, too, was silent, but her silence was of a different kind. Hers was the quiet of a hunted animal, a habit learned from years of trying to make herself small, to be invisible, to not provoke the anger of a man who held her life in his hands. His silence was a fortress built of grief. Hers was a cage built of fear. They existed in these 2 separate solitudes, orbiting each other in the confined space of the cabin, never touching. One evening, the loneliness became a physical thing, a crushing weight in her chest. The memory of her husband's face, his sneering words, the looks on the faces of the men he had. The thoughts came unbidden, a torrent of shame and filth. She fled to the small pantry at the back of the cabin, a dark, cold space that smelled of dried herbs and earth. She pressed her face into the rough log wall and wept, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. She did not want him to hear, did not want him to see this weakness, this brokenness. But he must have heard. The pantry door creaked open, spilling a rectangle of firelight into the darkness. She saw his large silhouette standing there. She froze, expecting him to demand what was wrong, to show impatience with her tears. She said nothing, her breath hitched in her throat. He did not ask. He stood there for a long moment, a silent, watchful presence. Then he turned, and she heard him move about the cabin. He returned a moment later and gently placed something soft and warm over her shoulders. It was a thick wool blanket from his own bedroll. He did not touch her, did not speak a single word. He simply left the blanket there, a quiet, tangible offering of comfort, and closed the door, leaving her once more in the privacy of the dark. She cried until she was empty, clutching the blanket that smelled of him, of wood smoke and the cold, clean mountains. The first real blizzard of the season came without warning. It started as a whisper of snow in the late afternoon and, by nightfall, had become a howling, monstrous beast. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin like a tormented spirit, and the snow fell so thick and fast it erased the world. For 3 days, they were prisoners. The darkness was absolute. the sun completely obscured by the roiling gray sky. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, the only sound the incessant, maddening roar of the storm. On the second day, the firewood ran out. The cold, which had been held at bay by the hearth, began to seep through the chinking in the logs, a creeping, insidious presence. They huddled in their furs, the temperature in the cabin plummeting. By the third day, the last of the dried meat was gone. A gnawing hunger set in, a hollow ache that compounded the misery of the cold. The silence between them was no longer one of grief or fear, but of grim survival. It was the cold that broke her. Her body, already weakened by her ordeal and the meager diet, had no reserves left. A deep, racking cough started in her chest, and by the evening of the third day, she was burning with fever. The world began to tilt and swim, the shadows in the corners of the room twisting into menacing shapes. The howling of the wind became a chorus of accusing voices. She was falling, tumbling into a black, icy abyss. Through the fog of her delirium, she was aware of Elias. He was there, a solid presence in the terrifying chaos of her mind. She felt him lift her, his arms strong and sure. He carried her to his own pallet, the one with the thickest furs, and wrapped her in them, piling every blanket and skin in the cabin on top of her. The weight was immense, but it could not stop the shivers that shook her to her core. She felt him lie down beside her, his large body a barrier against the encroaching cold. He pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her, sharing his own dwindling body heat. His warmth was a small, precious island in an ocean of ice. She was only vaguely aware of his presence as she drifted in and out of consciousness, lost in a fever dream of falling snow and faceless men. But through the long, dark night, as he held her, she heard him whisper a name, over and over, his voice thick with a sorrow that transcended time. "Rose, Rose, I'm sorry." When Clara finally woke, the world was silent. The wind had died. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the snow-caked window, illuminating a cabin that looked like a battlefield. She was lying on Elias's pallet, cocooned in a mountain of furs. The fever had broken. Her skin was slick with sweat, but her mind was clear. She turned her head. Elias was asleep beside her, slumped against the wall. He was fully clothed, his face etched with exhaustion. His hand was still resting on her wrist, his fingers curled loosely around her pulse point. He had not let go. He had stayed with her, a human anchor, and pulled her back from the edge. She stared at the way his calloused thumb rested against the thin skin of her wrist, a point of connection so intimate and yet so completely devoid of anything but a desperate will to keep her alive. She lay perfectly still, not wanting to wake him, watching the slow, even rise and fall of his chest. He slept through the morning. When he finally stirred, he pulled his hand back as if he had been burned, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before his usual stoic mask fell back into place. Neither of them spoke of it. After a few more days of rest, her strength began to return. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world of pristine, sculpted white. The silence of the cabin felt different now, charged with the memory of those desperate hours. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the unspoken question burned in her mind until she could no longer contain it. "Who was Rose?" she asked, her voice quiet in the crackling stillness. Elias did not look at her. He stared into the flames, his jaw tight. For a long time, she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough rasp, heavy with a guilt that was as old as the mountains. "She died because I was too slow." That was all he said. It was not an explanation, but a confession, a life sentence he had passed on himself. He offered no more, and she did not ask. She understood that the single, brutal sentence was the key to the fortress he had built around himself. She, in turn, shared nothing of her own past. She could not bring herself to speak of the shame, of the degradation, But her body carried its own story. The bruises on her arms and ribs, inflicted by her husband in a final, drunken rage before she fled, were beginning to fade, turning from a violent purple to a sickly yellow-green. She kept them hidden beneath the sleeves and bodice of her dress, but she knew they were there, a constant, ugly reminder. Her past did not stay buried forever. One night, it clawed its way out of her subconscious. She was dreaming of a narrow, gas-lit room, the air thick with cheap perfume and whiskey. Her husband was there, his face distorted in a leering grin, his hand shoving her forward. A man with a fat, sweaty face was reaching for her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She felt a searing pain across her back, the sting of a leather strap, and the sound of men's laughter. She woke up screaming, a raw, terrified sound that tore from her throat. She was sitting bolt upright on the cot, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the phantom pain still sizzling on her skin. The cabin door flew open, and Elias was there, his rifle in his hand, his eyes wild and alert, scanning the darkness for a threat. He saw her on the cot, trembling, her face chalk white in the moonlight. He saw there was no intruder, no bear, no immediate danger. His shoulders sagged with relief. But then his gaze fell on her back, in her violent awakening. The bearskin had fallen away, and the thin fabric of her nightshift had twisted, pulling taut across her shoulders. The moonlight, slanting through the window, illuminated the story she had kept hidden. It was an old scar, long healed, but its silvery, raised line was stark against her pale skin. A permanent welt that ran from the top of her shoulder blade down across her back. It was not a scar from an accident. It was the deliberate mark of a whip or a belt. He saw it. She knew he did. His breath hitched, a small, sharp sound in the quiet room. He took a half step forward, then stopped. And then he did something that struck her more deeply than any touch could have. He turned away. He turned his back to her, granting her a privacy she had not even thought to ask for, shielding her from his gaze as she scrambled to pull the fur back over her shoulders, to hide the mark of her shame. He stood there, his back to her. For a long, silent moment, the only sound was her own ragged breathing. "Did he do that to you?" he asked, his voice low and strained, thick with a cold, controlled rage she had never heard before. He did not need to say who he was. They both knew. The word hung in the air between them, heavy and poisonous. Clara could not speak. The words were lodged in her throat, choked by a shame so profound it felt like strangulation. She could only sit there, shaking in the dark, clutching the bearskin to her chest. She said nothing. But in the terrible, ringing silence of the mountain cabin, her silence was answer enough. Spring did not arrive in the high ridges with the gentle grace of a southern belle. It came like a reluctant brawler, fighting for every inch of ground. The thaw was a slow, messy affair. A constant sound of dripping water from the eaves of the cabin and the gurgle of unseen rivulets beneath the shrinking snowpack. The air, for weeks, carried the clean, sharp scent of melting ice and the rich, damp perfume of awakening earth. For Clara, who had known only the four walls of the cabin and the suffocating white of the blizzard, it felt like a resurrection. The world outside was no longer a threat, but a promise. As the snow receded, revealing the bruised and battered ground, Elias began to take her with him on his shorter excursions. Her ankle was strong now, and the memory of him carrying her was a strange, warm thing she kept tucked away in a corner of her heart, refusing to examine it too closely. He led her down to the valley, where a creek, swollen and loud with melted snow, rushed over a bed of smooth stones. It was there he taught her to fish. He did not give grand instructions, but showed her, his large hands patient as he baited a simple hook with a grub he dug from a rotting log. He showed her how to cast the line with a flick of the wrist, how to feel the subtle tension that signaled a bite. They would stand for hours on the bank, the roar of the water a constant companion, their silence comfortable for the first time. She learned to read the river as he did, to see the darker pools where the trout would likely be hiding. When she caught her first fish, a small, beautiful creature that shimmered with all the colors of a mountain sunrise, a genuine, unforced smile broke across her face. Elias saw it, and a corresponding softness touched the corners of his own mouth. A rare and fleeting thing. A week later, he taught her to shoot. He placed his heavy rifle in her hands, and the weight of it surprised her. It was a tool of death, cold and impersonal, and she flinched from it. "You need to know," was all he said, his voice low and serious. "This ain't a place that forgives weakness." He stood behind her, his body a solid wall of warmth at her back. He adjusted her stance, his hands briefly on her shoulders, a touch so practical and devoid of anything but instruction that it did not alarm her. He showed her how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel, how to squeeze the trigger slow and steady, not jerk it. "Breathe out," he murmured, his voice close to her ear, a low rumble that vibrated through her. "And hold it." She did as he said. She lined up the sight on a dead pine stump 100 yards away, the world narrowing to that single point. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a violent kick against her shoulder, a deafening crack that echoed off the granite cliffs. The shot went wide, kicking up a spray of dirt a foot to the left of the stump. "Again," he said, his voice calm and steady. Again and again she fired, until her shoulder ached and her ears rang. With each shot, he offered a quiet correction. "Don't anticipate the kick. Keep your eye open. Squeeze, don't pull." Slowly, her shots grew closer to the mark. Finally, a piece of bark flew from the edge of the stump. It was not a bullseye, but it was a hit. A small thrill, sharp and unfamiliar, went through her. It was the feeling of control, of power, something she had not felt in a very long time. In these shared moments, a quiet tenderness began to grow between them. It was not physical, not a thing of longing touches or heated glances. It was an aching, protective thing, born of shared solitude and witnessed pain. It was in the way he would leave a tin cup of hot, pine-needle tea by her cot in the morning before he left. It was in the way she would save him the best portion of the rabbit stew, making sure he ate first. It was in the way he began to talk to her, not in long conversations, but in small, offered fragments of himself. He would point out the track of a deer, name a bird by its call, or explain which roots were safe to eat. And she, in turn, would listen. Her presence a quiet invitation for him to fill the silence he had inhabited for so long. Their first real laugh came by the creek. Clara was trying to gut a fish, her hands clumsy and slick with slime. The slippery creature shot from her grasp, flew through the air in a perfect arc, and landed with a wet smack right in the middle of Elias's chest. He looked down at the trout, then up at her, his face a mask of stunned surprise. A giggle escaped her lips, a sound so alien she barely recognized it as her own. And then he smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his stormy eyes and crinkled the corners, transforming his hard face into something boyish and handsome. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest, and soon they were both laughing, the sound of it bright and clean against the roar of the creek. It was the first time she had seen the man, not the mountain, the first time she had seen the soul, not the scars. That night, sitting by the fire, the ease of their shared laughter lingered in the air. He was cleaning his rifle, his movements methodical. The silence felt different, less heavy. "I wasn't always up here," he said suddenly, his voice quiet. Clara looked up from her mending, surprised. He rarely volunteered information about his past. He kept his eyes on the rifle, running an oiled cloth down the barrel. "I was a scout. For the Union. Fought in the war for 4 years. He paused, his hands stilling. "The war teaches you things. How to read the land. How to track a man. How to move like a ghost so the world don't even know you're there." He looked up, his gaze meeting hers across the flickering flames. "But mostly, it teaches you how to vanish. how to turn off the part of you that feels things. Because if you feel, you die. He looked back down at the gun in his hands. I was good at it. Too good. When the fighting was over, I couldn't figure out how to come back, how to stop being a shadow. He swallowed. A difficult, painful motion. Rose, she tried to help me come back. He did not need to say more. The guilt he carried was a palpable thing in the small cabin. It was the guilt of a man who believed he had failed the one person who had seen the good in him. The ghost he had become unable to protect the woman who was all flesh and blood. His isolation was not a preference. It was a penance. Clara's heart ached for him. She saw the boy he must have been before the war had burned the softness out of him. She saw the man he could have been, if not for the ghosts he carried. Her hand lay on the rough blanket beside her, and she had the strongest urge to reach across the small space between them, to lay her hand on his, to offer a simple, human touch of comfort. But she did not. The chasm of their separate pains was still too wide to cross, so she just sat there, her needles still, and listened, letting her silence be a testament to the fact that she had heard him, that his story was safe with her. The outside world intruded on their sanctuary in the form of a traveling peddler. He was a small, wiry man named Finn, with a pack mule laden with all manner of goods, from tin pots to bolts of calico. He was the first new face Clara had seen in months. Elias traded several fine beaver pelts for coffee, sugar, and flour, rare luxuries that felt like a king's ransom. As Elias was loading the goods, Finn's shrewd eyes landed on Clara, who was standing in the doorway of the cabin. A slow, greasy smile of recognition spread across his face. Well, I'll be, he said, his voice loud and carrying. I know you, Clara May. Saw you down in the saloon in Laramie. A year ago? Maybe more. He looked from her to Elias, his eyes gleaming with a malicious sort of gossip. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, but it was still loud enough for her to hear every venomous word. You best be careful with that one. Boone, that one's been passed around like bad coin. The world stopped. The air rushed from Clara's lungs, and a hot, sickening wave of shame washed over her, so powerful it made her sway. The peddler's words were a brand, searing the filth of her past onto her skin for Elias to see. She could not look at Elias. She stared at the ground, at her own feet, waiting for the disgust, the recrimination, the inevitable casting out. Elias did not respond. He did not deny it, did not defend her, did not even look at the peddler. He simply finished tying the sack of flour to his mule, his movements deliberate and controlled. But Clara, chancing a quick glance at him from beneath her eyelashes, saw it. She saw the muscle jump in his jaw. She saw the way his knuckles turned white as he cinched the rope, and she saw the look in his eyes. The quiet gray had turned to the color of a thunderhead, a storm of something cold and violent gathering in their depths. It was not hurt for his own reputation. It was a deep, profound hurt for her. Finn, seeing he would get no response, shrugged and led his mule away. Whistling a jaunty tune, the sound of it was obscene in the sudden, ringing silence. That night, the easy quiet between them was gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. Clara could not eat. She could not speak. The peddler's words echoed in her mind, poisoning the fragile peace she had found. Finally, when she could bear it no longer, she knew she had to speak the whole, ugly truth. She had to show him the full extent of her ruin, so he would understand why she was not worth his kindness, not worth his protection. He was telling the truth, she said, her voice a low, trembling whisper. She stood by the hearth, her back to him, unable to face him. My husband, my former husband, his name was Arthur. He was a gambler. When the money ran out, he found other ways to pay his debts. She choked on the words, the shame a physical gag in her throat. He would put me in those rooms, in those saloons. With men, I ran away. But a woman like me, no decent man wants a woman like that. That is why Mr. Croft did not show. Someone told him. Someone always tells. She finally turned to look at him. He was standing by the table, his face carved from stone. "You see now, don't you?" she said, her voice breaking, the last of her defenses crumbling. "You see why no one will ever truly carry me? There is too much to carry. I am not worth the trouble." Elias stared at her, his face a maelstrom of emotions she could not read. Then, without a word, he turned, strode to the door, and when outside, she heard the sharp, ringing sound of his axe biting into the chopping block. And then it came again, and again, and again. A frantic, furious rhythm. He was not chopping wood for the fire. He was waging a war against the peddler, against her husband, against a world that could do such a thing to a woman. She watched from the window as he worked, his powerful body a silhouette against the rising moon. He did not stop until a great pile of split logs lay at his feet and his breath came in ragged, heaving gasps. He stood for a long time, his head bowed, leaning on the handle of the axe. When he finally came back inside, he did not look at her. He went to the water basin and washed his hands. She saw the blood in the water, saw the raw, torn skin on his palms where his fury had driven him past the point of pain. He dried his hands, turned to face her, and his eyes were clear and steady. "Don't you ever," he said, his voice low and intense, each word a carefully placed stone. "Let them speak for you." The next morning, when she woke, there was a pair of new boots sitting on the floor by her cot. They were made of soft, sturdy deer hide, stitched together with a skill that was both rugged and precise. The soles were thick, meant for walking on hard mountain trails. He had made them for her. While she had slept, he had worked, channeling his rage and his sorrow into an act of creation, an act of profound, unspoken care. She slipped her feet into them. They fit perfectly. For the first time since she had stepped off that train, she had two shoes. She had a foundation. Later that day, they were working by the creek, reinforcing the bank with stones to keep the spring melt from washing it away. Clara slipped on a patch of wet clay, and Elias reached out to steady her, his hand catching her arm. She was covered in mud, a smear of it on her cheek. "You've got some mud," he said, his voice quiet. He raised his other hand, the one that was not holding her, and gently, with the side of his thumb, he brushed the mud from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, respectful. His hand was calloused and rough, but the gesture was the softest thing she had ever known. And in that moment, something inside her that had been frozen for years began to thaw. Without thinking, she leaned into his palm, a small, unconscious movement, a turning toward warmth, toward kindness. They both froze. His hand was still on her cheek, her face tilted up to his. The roar of the creek seemed to fade away. The world narrowed to the space between their faces, a space charged with all the unspoken words, all the shared pain, all the budding tenderness of the past months. His stormy eyes searched hers, and she saw not lust, but a question, a deep, aching uncertainty. It was too much. The intensity of it, the possibility of what it meant, terrified her. To feel this, to want this, was to need, and needing was a danger she had sworn she would never risk again. Clara pulled away first, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a half step back, putting distance between them. I'm afraid," she whispered, not looking at him. "I'm afraid of needing you." Elias let his hand drop to his side. He did not move closer, did not press her. He simply stood there, a solid, unshakable presence against the wild backdrop of the mountains. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, a vow spoken into the clean mountain air. "Then let me be the one man you never had to fear." The fragile peace they had built was shattered by the sound of shod horses on the trail below. It was a sound that did not belong in their secluded world. A harsh, metallic intrusion that spoke of the town and its laws. Elias, who had been skinning a rabbit by the cabin door, went still. His head came up, and he listened, not with his ears, but with his entire body, like an animal sensing a predator on the wind. He rose slowly, wiped his hands on his trousers, and picked up his rifle, all in one fluid, economical motion. "Stay inside," he said to Clara, his voice a low command. She retreated into the cabin, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She watched through a crack in the door as 3 riders emerged from the timberline. The man in the lead was Sheriff Brody, his familiar, thick form slumped in the saddle. The 2 men with him were strangers, deputies by the look of their badges, their faces hard and impassive. They rode into the clearing and reined in their horses, their presence an immediate and overwhelming violation of the sanctuary. Elias stood before the cabin, his rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm, a silent, unmovable guardian. "Boone," the sheriff said, his voice weary. He did not dismount. "We need a word." "You're having it," Elias replied, his tone flat and cold as a river stone. The sheriff sighed, shifting his weight in the saddle. "A man came into town yesterday. Name of Arthur Thompson. Says he's looking for his wife." He paused, letting the name hang in the air like a poisoned dart. "Says she ran off on him back in Missouri. He's got papers, a marriage license. Says she belongs to him." Clara's blood ran cold. Arthur, he had found her. The monster from her nightmares was no longer a dream. He was real, and he was close. "Never heard of him," Elias said, his voice utterly devoid of expression. "And there ain't no woman here." It was a lie, bald and direct, spoken to the face of the law. He was protecting her, building a wall of denial around her with nothing but his words and the rifle in his arms. But Clara knew it was a wall that would not hold. She could not hide behind him forever. Hiding was what she had always done. It was what had kept her a victim. In the months she had spent with Elias, a new and unfamiliar strength had taken root in her. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was there. She would not cower in the shadows while he fought her battles. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and pushed the door open. She stepped out into the sunlight, her chin held high, and stood beside Elias. She was wearing the boots he had made her. She was clean. Her hair was brushed. She was not the broken creature who had stumbled off the train. Sheriff Brody's eyes widened slightly in surprise, then settled into a look of grim resignation. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat with a reluctant sort of respect. "He ain't my husband," Clara said, her voice shaking only slightly. "Not anymore." "The law might see it different," the sheriff said, his gaze hard and direct. "He has a legal claim. He says you stole from him when you left. Now, I ain't here to drag you back to him, not today, but I'm giving you fair warning. He's asking questions, showing your picture around. If he finds you, if he comes up here to claim what's his, my hands will be tied. I won't be able to stop him." The finality of his words was a death sentence. The law, the great and righteous institution that was supposed to protect the innocent, would deliver her back to her tormentor. The strength she had summoned moments before dissolved, leaving her raw and exposed. The world began to swim before her eyes. The trees, the mountains, the faces of the men all blurring into a meaningless swirl. A terrible, keening sound built in her chest, the sound of a spirit breaking. She swayed on her feet, and in that moment, she felt Elias move beside her. He reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he had ever done so. His calloused fingers wrapped around hers, a firm, grounding pressure that cut through the fog of her panic. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the sheriff, but his grip was an anchor in the storm, a silent, public declaration. In front of the law, in front of the world that would condemn her. He stood with her. He held her hand, and in that simple, profound act, he claimed her as his own to protect. "You've delivered your warning, Sheriff," Elias said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Now ride out." Sheriff Brody held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. He turned his horse, and he and his men rode back down the trail, their departure leaving a silence that was heavier and more menacing than their presence had been. The moment they were gone, the strength flowed out of Clara's knees. She collapsed, not to the ground, but against Elias, her face buried in the rough wool of his shirt. A storm of sobs tore through her, the ugly, ragged sounds of a terror too deep for tears. He did not speak. He simply stood there, a solid rock in her sea of despair, one arm coming around her to hold her steady, his other hand still gripping hers as if he would never let go. That night, they made a plan. The cabin was no longer safe. Arthur was a bloodhound, and the town was full of men who would sell her location for a few silver dollars. "There's a place," Elias said, his voice low as he stared into the fire. "A hunting lodge. I built it years ago, before. It's higher up, deep in the wilderness. A man would have to be part mountain goat to find it if he didn't know the way." They would leave at dawn. Flight was their only option. To stay was to wait for the inevitable. They began to pack, a grim and silent task. They gathered what little they could carry: dried meat, flour, salt, ammunition, blankets. As Clara was folding a blanket, her hands trembling so badly she could barely manage the simple task. She knew she could not let him do this without knowing everything. He was preparing to risk his life for her, to abandon his home for her. He deserved the whole, terrible truth. She stopped what she was doing and turned to face him. He was checking his rifle, his brow furrowed in concentration.
"Elias,"
she said, her voice a barely audible whisper. He looked up, his stormy eyes questioning. She could not meet his gaze. She looked down at her hands, at the worn, faded fabric of the blanket. "There's something else," she said, the words sticking in her throat like burrs. "Something I should have told you." She took a shaky breath. "The reason I was so sick, after the blizzard, it wasn't just the cold." She forced herself to look at him, to let him see the full measure of her shame. "I'm with child." He did not move. He did not breathe. He simply stared at her, his face unreadable. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire. She saw the question in his eyes before he asked it. "It's his," she whispered, the admission a final, devastating blow. "Arthur's. I've known since before I left Missouri. I hid it. I was so lost. I wasn't sure if I wanted to live, let alone bring a child into this world." This, she thought, would be the end. This was the one thing that would finally make him turn away. She was not just a ruined woman. She was a ruined woman carrying the seed of the very man who had destroyed her, the man who was now hunting them. She was a walking, breathing reminder of her own degradation. Elias was silent for a full minute. He looked from her face to her belly, still flat beneath her dress, and then back to her face. He was processing the information, his mind working behind the stillness of his features. She braced herself for the revulsion, the quiet, final judgment. When he finally spoke, his voice was as low and steady as it had ever been. "It changes nothing." The journey into the high country was a desperate flight. They pushed themselves hard, moving from before sunrise until after sunset, trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the world of men. The mountains, which had been a place of healing, were now a landscape of looming dangers. The weather turned against them, a late spring snowstorm sweeping down from the peaks, blinding them with a swirl of wet, heavy flakes and turning the treacherous trail to slick mud. One night, as they huddled around a small, smoky fire, a pair of yellow eyes gleamed at them from the darkness just beyond the firelight. Wolves. They had been trailing them for miles, drawn by the scent of the mule. Elias fired his rifle into the air, the sound a flat, angry crack in the vast silence. The eyes vanished. but they could hear the wolves howling to each other in the distance, a lonely, predatory sound that promised they would be back. Another night, a different kind of danger found them. A gaunt, bearded prospector, his eyes wild with gold fever and loneliness, stumbled upon their camp, drawn by the light. He stared at Clara with a raw, hungry look that made her skin crawl. Elias rose to his full height, his hand never leaving the stock of his rifle, his presence a clear and menacing warning. He said nothing, but his silence was more threatening than any words could have been. The prospector muttered an apology and melted back into the woods. But the encounter left them both shaken. The wilderness was full of its own kind of desperate, lawless men. Through it all, Clara's health began to fail. The morning sickness, which had been mild before, now racked her body. The constant, grueling pace of their flight left her exhausted, her face pale and drawn. The pregnancy, conceived in violence and carried in fear, was not going well. It was a poison inside her, draining her of what little strength she had left. She felt like a blight, a curse upon the one good man she had ever known. He deserved a whole woman, a good woman who could give him strong sons and walk beside him without fear. He did not deserve her, broken and defiled, carrying another man's child, a devil's child. The thought festered, growing into a terrible, self-loathing certainty. One morning, before the sun was up, she could bear it no longer. While Elias was checking the perimeter of their camp, she scribbled a hasty note on a piece of torn paper, her tears smudging the charcoal. She left it by his bedroll, took a small portion of bread, and slipped out of the camp, heading back down the trail they had just climbed. It was a fool's errand. She would likely die of exposure or be found by Arthur. But in her despair, it felt like the only honorable thing to do. She could not let her darkness extinguish his light. She had not gotten a quarter of a mile when she heard him coming after her. He was not running. He was just walking, his long, relentless stride eating up the distance between them. She tried to hurry, but her body was too weak. He caught up to her in a small clearing, the rising sun backlighting his formidable frame. He did not yell. He did not demand an explanation. He simply walked up to her and took the piece of bread from her hand. "You deserve more," she sobbed, the words torn from her. More than someone broken, carrying a devil's child. Elias looked down at her, his face grim, his eyes blazing with an emotion she had never seen before, not pity, not anger, but a fierce, protective possession. "You don't get to walk away," he said, his voice a low, rough growl. "Not alone." And before she could protest, before she could argue, he bent down and lifted her into his arms, just as he had done all those months ago. She was heavier now, with a small life inside her. But he held her just as easily. He held her close against his chest and turned back up the mountain, his stride never faltering. They arrived at the lodge 2 days later. It was even more remote than she had imagined, perched on a high ledge overlooking a vast, untouched valley. But it was in a state of near ruin. The roof had partially collapsed under the weight of winter snows, and the wind whistled through great gaps in the log walls. It was a skeleton of a shelter, a testament to the years of neglect and loneliness. It was barely standing, but it was a foundation. Elias set her down gently inside the derelict structure. He looked at the broken roof, at the debris-strewn floor, and then he looked at her. A slow, determined smile touched his lips. "We can rebuild," he said. And so they did. He worked from dawn until dusk, a man possessed of a singular, driving purpose. He felled trees, hewed logs, and cleared the rubble, and Clara worked beside him. She was not strong enough for the heavy lifting, but she did what she could. She gathered moss and mud to chink the logs. She brought him tools. She kept the fire going. She was not a damsel waiting to be rescued. She was a partner, together, under the vast, silent gaze of the mountains. They began to build their home, a fortress of hope against a world that had tried its best to destroy them. The labor came on a starless night in late autumn, with a wind that clawed at the new roof of the lodge and screamed down the stone chimney. It came too soon. The child was not due for another 6 weeks, but the hardship of their flight and the fragility of Clara's health had taken their toll. It began as a dull ache in her back and, by midnight, had become a relentless, vicious tide of pain that threatened to tear her apart. There was no one to help, no midwife, no neighbor. There was only Elias. He moved with a desperate, clumsy urgency, his hands, so skilled with an axe or a rifle, now trembling and uncertain. He boiled water, tore strips from their cleanest linens, and wiped the sweat from her brow with a touch that was infinitely gentle. He was a man accustomed to facing death in its many violent forms, but the sight of life's brutal, bloody entrance into the world terrified him in a way no enemy ever could. He saw her strength failing, her face growing pale and translucent in the flickering firelight. He saw the life draining from her and was helpless to stop it. He knelt beside her, his large frame hunched in a posture of desperate prayer, whispering her name, begging her to hold on. Clara fought through a red haze of agony, her body a battlefield. She was slipping away, the darkness at the edge of her vision closing in. But then she would feel his hand gripping hers, a solid, living anchor, and she would hear his voice, a low, ragged plea, and she would fight her way back. For him, she would not leave him alone again. In the gray, exhausted hours of dawn, as the storm outside finally wept itself into a cold drizzle, the child was born, a final, soul-tearing push, and then a strange, sudden silence, broken a moment later by a thin, wavering cry. It was a girl. She was terrifyingly small, her skin mottled and bluish, her limbs thin as a bird's, but she was alive. Elias, his hands shaking so violently he could barely function, cleaned the infant and wrapped her in the softest piece of flannel they owned. He laid the tiny bundle in Clara's arms. Clara, hovering in the twilight between life and death, looked down at the small, wrinkled face, at the impossibly tiny fingers curled into a fist, and felt a surge of love so fierce and protective it burned away the pain. This small, struggling creature was not a devil's child. She was a miracle. "Hope," Clara whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Her name is Hope." Elias stood watching, his face a wreck of exhaustion and fear and overwhelming relief. And then he did something Clara had never seen him do. His stoic, unbreachable composure finally shattered. He sank to his knees beside the bed, his broad shoulders shaking. He covered his face with his blood-flecked hands and wept. Not quiet, dignified tears, but great, heaving, silent sobs that came from a place of grief and guilt that had been locked away for a decade. He wept for Rose, whom he had lost. He wept for Clara, whom he had almost lost. And he wept for the tiny, impossible child named Hope, who represented a future he never believed he would have. He cried until he was empty, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were red and raw, but they were clear. The ghosts had, for a moment, been chased into the light. Their fragile peace lasted less than a month. The news came with a grizzled old trapper named Jedediah, who passed by the lodge on his way to his wintering grounds. He traded them news for a cup of hot coffee, his words delivered in a blunt, matter-of-fact tone that made them all the more chilling. "There's a fella down in Cutter's Pass," he said, warming his hands by the fire. "A slick-looking man with a mean mouth, name of Thompson. He's been buying drinks, asking questions, about you, Boone, and about a woman. He's hired a couple of hard cases, bounty men from the look of 'em. He's offering a reward, says he's coming up here to collect his property." Jedediah took a sip of his coffee. "Heard him say he plans to be here before the first deep snow." The world tilted once more. The monster was coming. And this time, he was not just coming for her. He was coming for her child. The moment the trapper was gone, Elias became the Union scout once more. The brief softness he had allowed himself was gone. replaced by a cold, deadly pragmatism. His movements became precise, his eyes hard and calculating as he surveyed their mountain fortress. He spent the next several days preparing for a siege. He felled trees, creating a deadfall on the narrowest part of the trail. He cleared firing lines, fortified the windows of the lodge, and cached extra ammunition and water inside. He checked and rechecked their rifles, his hands now as steady as the granite cliffs. His plan was simple. When the time came, he would send her and the baby away. There was a hidden cave system a mile deeper into the mountains. She would take Hope and hide there until it was over. He would stay. He would fight. He would be the wall that stood between them and the coming evil. He explained it to her one evening, his voice calm and reasonable, as if he were discussing the weather. Clara listened, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She looked at the primitive cradle he had carved for Hope, at the new, sturdy roof over their heads, at the man who was willing to die to protect them, and she knew she would not run. She would not hide again. She waited until he was finished. Then she looked him square in the eye. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. Elias frowned.
Clara, this ain't a discussion. It's the only way.
"No," she repeated. She stood up and walked over to him, placing her hand on his arm. "All my life, I have been running from men like him. You taught me how to stand. You taught me how to shoot. You put shoes on my feet and a roof over my head." She looked toward the cradle where Hope was sleeping. "You gave me a reason to fight. You carried me here, Elias. Now, let me carry us now." He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw not the frightened, broken woman he had found on the train platform, but a woman made of mountain granite and river steel. A woman who would not be sent away, who would not be protected, but who would stand and fight beside him. He saw a partner. He saw a wife. And in his eyes, she saw a reluctant, grudging, and profound respect. He gave a slow, single nod. They would face it together. The attack came at night. A week later, there was no warning, just the sudden, sharp crack of a rifle shot from the darkness, the bullet splintering the wood of the doorframe inches from Elias's head. The siege had begun. The world dissolved into a chaos of noise and muzzle flashes. Gunshots tore through the dark, a symphony of violence. Elias, positioned at one window, fired back with a calm, deadly efficiency. Clara, her heart pounding in her throat, was at the other, Hope's cradle safely behind a barricade of furniture. She lifted the heavy rifle, its stock cold and unfamiliar against her cheek. She could see dark shapes moving in the trees, men fanning out to surround them. She aimed at one of the flashes and fired. She did not know if she hit anything. She just reloaded, her hands shaking, and fired again. A bullet whizzed past her head, shattering the small tin mirror on the wall. Elias grunted, a sharp intake of breath.
Elias,
she cried out. "I'm all right," he ground out. But she saw him slump against the wall, his hand clutching his leg. A dark stain was spreading through his trousers just above the knee. He was wounded. Fear, cold and sharp, threatened to paralyze her. But then she heard a soft whimper from the cradle, and a fierce, primal rage burned the fear away. They would not have her child. She turned back to the window, her resolve hardening. She saw a man break from the cover of the trees, making a run for the side of the cabin. She tracked him in her sights, just as Elias had taught her. She breathed out, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The man cried out, a short, sharp sound, and fell. He did not get back up. Clara stared at the dark shape on the ground, a wave of nausea rolling over her. She had just killed a man. She had taken a life. Her stomach heaved, and a choked sob escaped her lips. She began to shake, the rifle suddenly too heavy to hold.
Clara,
Elias's voice was sharp, cutting through her shock.
Look at me.
She turned. His face was pale with pain, but his eyes were clear and hard.
You did what you had to do. Now reload.
His words were not a comfort. They were a command. The command of a soldier to another. They pulled her back from the edge. She took a shuddering breath, wiped the tears from her eyes, and reloaded the rifle. The fight raged on for what felt like an eternity. Then, suddenly, there was a lull. The shooting stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise.
"He's coming,"
Elias whispered, trying to push himself up and failing, his face contorted in pain.
"Arthur, he'll come to the door."
And then they heard his voice, oily and familiar, a snake slithering through the dark. "Clara May, I know you're in there, you filthy whore! I've come for what's mine! Come on out, and I might let the mountain man live!" The cabin door, weakened by the gunfire, suddenly burst inward with a splintering crash. Arthur Thompson stood there, a silhouette against the moonlit snow, his face a mask of triumphant rage. His eyes, wild and bloodshot, found her across the room.
"There you are,"
he sneered, raising his pistol. But before he could fire, a blur of motion came from the side. Elias, with a roar of pure, primal fury, launched himself from the floor, ignoring the searing pain in his leg, and tackled Arthur around the waist. The two men crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs, the pistol flying from Arthur's hand. It was a brutal, desperate struggle. Arthur was younger, stronger, but Elias was fueled by a righteous rage. They rolled across the floor, their grunts and curses filling the small cabin. Clara, frozen for a moment in horror, was jolted into action by a cry from the cradle. She saw the pistol lying near the hearth. She scrambled for it, her fingers closing around the cold steel. Elias was weakening. His leg was giving out. Arthur gained the upper hand, his thick fingers closing around Elias's throat, squeezing the life from him. Elias's face began to turn a dusky purple. Clara raised the pistol with both hands, the barrel shaking. "Get off him!" she screamed. Arthur looked up, his face twisted in a sneer.
"You ain't got the nerve, you worthless."
He never finished the sentence. She fired. The explosion was deafening in the small space. A look of stunned surprise crossed Arthur's face. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He slumped sideways, his grip on Elias loosening, and lay still. The monster was dead. The law arrived 3 days later. Sheriff Brody, looking older and more weary than ever, rode into the clearing alone. He found a scene of grim carnage. 2 bodies lay in the snow outside. Inside, Arthur Thompson lay on the floor, covered by a blanket. Clara sat in a chair, her face pale and hollow, rocking a sleeping child in a cradle. Elias lay on the cot, his leg crudely splinted and bandaged, his face tight with pain and fever. The air was thick with the smells of gunpowder, blood, and death. The sheriff took it all in, his gaze missing nothing. He looked at the dead man on the floor, then at Clara. "You could be arrested for this," he said, his voice quiet, heavy. "Vigilantism, murder." Elias pushed himself up on one elbow, his eyes blazing. "Then let them come," he said, his voice a low growl. "Let them try." Sheriff Brody looked at Elias, defiant and wounded. He looked at Clara, a ghost of a woman protecting her child. He looked at the sleeping baby, the innocent heart of the whole bloody affair. He stood there for a long time, the law of the town warring with the justice of the mountains. Finally, he turned his gaze away, looking out the door at the vast, indifferent peaks. "I was tracking a fugitive," he said, his voice flat, as if reciting a report. "Looks like he ran into some trouble with a bear." He turned back, his eyes briefly meeting Clara's. "I saw nothing." He tipped his hat, turned, and left, his footsteps silent in the snow. Summer returned to the high country not as a guest, but as a rightful queen, reclaiming her throne from the grip of winter. The sun, warm and benevolent, lingered long in the sky. melting the last stubborn patches of snow and coaxing a riot of green from the meadows. The world felt new, washed clean by the violence of the past and ready for a quiet season of growth. Elias's wounds healed with the same slow, stubborn reluctance as the land itself. The bullet had shattered bone in his leg, and the healing was a painful, arduous process. For weeks, he was confined to the cot, a man of motion and action trapped in a prison of stillness. The fever, a constant, lurking threat, would spike in the nights, leaving him drenched in sweat and muttering half-formed names in a delirious sleep. Rose, his mother, men she did not know from a war-long past. In this time of weakness, their roles reversed. Clara became his anchor, his caregiver, his strength. Every day was a ritual of quiet devotion. She would rise before him, her movements silent so as not to wake him, and go down to the creek for fresh, cold water. She learned the language of the forest's pharmacy, seeking out the herbs Jedediah had told her about. Yarrow to staunch the bleeding when she changed the dressing. Willow bark to brew into a bitter tea for the fever. She tended to the wound with a steady hand, her stomach no longer turning at the sight of torn flesh. She cleaned it, applied poultices, and wrapped it in fresh linen, her touch gentle but firm. She fed him, spooning nourishing broths made from rabbit or squirrel into his mouth when he was too weak to lift his head. She read to him from the single, tattered book she owned, a collection of poems, her voice a low, soothing murmur against the vast mountain silence. She did not fuss or coddle. She simply did what needed to be done, her presence a constant, reassuring warmth. In his vulnerability, she found a new strength, a fierce, boundless well of competence she never knew she possessed. He, who had always been the protector, was now the protected, and he allowed it, a silent surrender that was perhaps the most profound act of trust he had ever shown. As his body healed, they turned their attention to the lodge. The structure was sound, a fortress that had saved their lives, but it was not yet a home. They rebuilt it with a care that bordered on reverence. Elias, now on a crude crutch he had carved for himself, directed the work, his scout's eye for detail ensuring every log was perfectly notched, every seam tightly chinked against the wind. Clara worked beside him, her hands, once soft and useless, now calloused and capable. She mixed the mud and moss, her fingers deep in the cool, damp earth. She smoothed it into the gaps in the walls, sealing them against the winter to come. One afternoon, on a trip down to the valley, she found a patch of wild columbine, their delicate, spurred blossoms a splash of brilliant blue against the green. Carefully, she dug up the roots, wrapped them in damp leaves, and carried them back to the lodge. By the front door, in a small patch of earth she had cleared of stones, she planted them. It was a small act, a woman's touch in a world of masculine hardship, but it was a declaration. It was an act of faith, a belief in a future that would be beautiful, a promise that life, not just survival, would grow here. Elias watched her from the doorway, his crutch leaning against the frame, and said nothing. But a soft, quiet light entered his eyes, a light she had never seen before. News of the world below trickled up to them with Jedediah, who now made the lodge a regular stop on his circuit. He told them the stories that were taking root in Cutter's Pass. The truth, or a version of it, had slowly spread. Sheriff Brody, it seemed, had stuck to his story of a fugitive meeting his end at the claws of a bear, but the details of the siege had been pieced together from the boasts and ramblings of the one bounty man who had survived, fleeing with a bullet in his shoulder. Some of the townsfolk, the ones who had whispered about the runaway bride with one shoe, now whispered of the mountain man's woman, the one who had killed her own husband. The judgment was still there, a low, persistent hum. But others, the ones who understood the harsh justice of the wilderness, saw it differently. They saw a woman who had defended her child, a man who had defended his home, and then The gifts began to appear. Jedediah would arrive with a small, unexpected parcel, a sack of flour left for them at the general store by a rancher's wife, a small, intricately stitched dress for the baby, left anonymously. One day, he brought a heavy jar of golden honey, with a note that simply said, "For the child." They never knew who left these things, these quiet offerings of acceptance from a world that had once cast her out. Each one was a small, healing balm on the still raw wounds of her past. As Elias's leg grew stronger and he could sit for longer periods, he began to teach her how to carve. He gave her a small, sharp knife and a block of soft pine. His large, scarred hand would cover hers, guiding the blade, showing her how to feel the grain of the wood, how to shave off thin, fragrant curls, how to make the wood obey her will. It was a quiet, intimate act, a sharing of a skill that was as much a part of him as breathing. They would sit on the porch in the long summer evenings, the only sounds the scrape of their knives and the soft gurgle of hope sleeping in her cradle. Clara took to it with a natural, surprising aptitude. The focus it required quieted the restless ghosts in her mind. Her first creations were crude, a lopsided bird, a misshapen flower, but she grew more skilled, her hands learning a new kind of grace. And then she began to work on a new cradle for hope. The first one had been a simple, functional box. This one was an act of love, into the soft pine. She carved the shapes of the mountains that surrounded them. She carved the columbine flowers that now bloomed by the door. She carved a small, soaring hawk on the headboard, a symbol of the fierce, free spirit she wished for her daughter. When it was finished, it was more than a piece of furniture. It was a story, their story, etched in wood. One morning, just as the sun was cresting the eastern ridge, bathing the valley in a clean, golden light, Clara stood on the porch. She was barefoot, a habit she had acquired in the safety of their home. She liked the feel of the solid, sun-warmed planks beneath her feet. It made her feel grounded, connected to this place that was hers. She held a warm tin cup of coffee, watching the mists burn off the distant peaks, a profound sense of peace settling over her. She did not hear Elias approach, but she felt his presence behind her. He walked over and, without a word, knelt before her. It was a gesture of such unexpected reverence that it stole her breath. In his hands, he held a new pair of shoes. They were not the rough, practical boots he had made for her before. These were softer, made of the finest, most supple doeskin, dyed a rich brown with walnut husks. They were stitched with a delicate, decorative pattern around the edges. They were not shoes for survival. They were a gift of beauty. He took her right foot in his hand, his touch gentle, and slipped the shoe on. Then he did the same with the left. He remained kneeling for a moment, his head bowed, holding her feet in his hands. She looked down at his dark, bent head, at the strength in his shoulders, at the hands that had fought for her, healed her, and now served her. The circle was complete. He had found her with one shoe, a symbol of her brokenness. Now, he was making her whole. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "You don't have to carry me anymore," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion so deep it had no name. Elias looked up, his stormy eyes soft and clear. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle, lingering kiss to her knuckles. "Then walk beside me," he said. They were married a week later, on a perfect summer afternoon. There was no preacher, no congregation. Their church was a cathedral of ancient pines, their witness the silent, watching mountains. Elias wore a clean flannel shirt. Clara wore a simple dress she had sewn from a bolt of blue calico, a columbine tucked into her braided hair. Hope, dressed in the gift from the town, was held securely in a sling on Elias's chest, her small, happy gurgles the only music. They did not speak vows. They did not need to. They simply stood before each other, hand in hand, and the promises were there in their eyes. promises of faithfulness, of partnership, of a shared future built from the wreckage of their pasts. They were alone, but for the first time in their lives, they were entirely whole. The seasons turned, the scars remained. Elias always walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the night he had almost died for her. Clara's back still bore the silvery welt of her past, and in the deep, quiet hours of the night, the nightmares sometimes returned, but they were no longer alone in their pain. The scars remained, but so did the hands that held them. Hope grew from a fragile infant into a sturdy toddler with her mother's bright eyes and her father's solemn, watchful nature. Her laughter, a sound of pure, untainted joy, was the constant, beautiful music of their lives. One late afternoon, in the season when the aspens turned to rivers of gold, they were walking on a high trail, heading back to the lodge. The path was steep, and the climb was arduous. Clara, carrying a basket of late-season berries, felt the familiar ache in her feet, the burn in her calves. She paused, leaning against a rock to catch her breath. Hope, riding on Elias's shoulders, let out a delighted giggle, pointing at a hawk circling high above. Clara looked at her daughter, at her husband, at the breathtaking beauty of their home, and a feeling of such profound, impossible happiness washed over her that she laughed. It was a free, easy sound, full of a light she had once believed was extinguished forever. Elias turned, a slow smile spreading across his face, the one that still made her heart catch in her throat. He saw the weariness in her posture, the flush on her cheeks, but he also saw the unadulterated joy in her eyes.
Come on then, barefoot bride,
he said, his voice a low, loving rumble.
I'll carry you the rest of the way.
Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. And we invite you to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.